His children sold everything while he was in the ICU. His furniture, his clothes, his photographs, even the hand tools his grandfather had passed down to him 57 years ago, thrown into a dumpster like scrap metal, while a 74-year-old master carpenter lay unconscious, with machines keeping his heart beating. But his children didn't just sell everything. They filed papers to declare their own father mentally incompetent, convincing a realtor to list the house he had built with his own hands before the doctors had even finished running tests. They moved fast because they believed their father was a simple man with nothing but a tired old house and calloused hands that embarrassed them at dinner parties. But nobody knew what was hidden inside that house. Nobody knew about the door behind the kitchen, a door built so perfectly into the wall that you could press your palm flat against it and never feel the seam. Nobody knew that behind that door sat filing cabinets, a fireproof safe, and documents proving that the man his children called just a carpenter had quietly built a $4.7 million estate while they weren't paying attention. And nobody knew that every college tuition payment, every mortgage reduction, every wedding bill his children believed came from banks, and financial aid had actually come from him, paid in silence from accounts they never knew existed. But what happens when a father wakes up in the ICU and discovers his own children sold everything he built? What happens when he finds out they threw away his father's tools without a second thought? And what happens when the one door behind the kitchen they never bothered to open reveals that they didn't just sell his belongings, they sold their own inheritance out from under themselves? For 46 years, James Whitmore had lived in the house on Beckley Road. He bought it as a wreck when he was barely 28, a foreclosure with a cracked foundation and rotting window frames that nobody else wanted. But James was a carpenter, the kind of man who could look at a broken thing and see exactly what it was supposed to be. He spent 2 years rebuilding that house with his own hands. The oak staircase, the built-in bookshelves, the kitchen cabinets with dovetail joints so precise you could run your finger along the seams and never feel a gap. His wife, Eleanor, used to say the house didn't just belong to James, it was James. Every board and beam an extension of the man who shaped it. They raised 3 children inside those walls. David, the oldest, who watched his father measure twice and cut once and somehow decided that kind of patience was beneath him. Karen, the middle child, ambitious and restless, who moved through life as though standing still meant falling behind. And Lisa, the youngest, who once followed James around his workshop asking about every tool on the pegboard, but somewhere along the way stopped being curious and started being embarrassed. And it was Lisa who would eventually say the words that quietly broke her father's heart, words she never knew he heard. It happened at Lisa's wedding rehearsal dinner, a long table filled with strangers in pressed suits and expensive dresses. James was sitting near the end, wearing the best shirt he owned, his hands scrubbed clean, but still carrying the permanent lines of a man who had worked with wood his entire life. A guest leaned across the table and asked Lisa what her father did for a living. Lisa smiled, glanced briefly in James's direction, and said, "He spent his career in construction management." James was 3 feet away. He heard every word. He didn't flinch. He smiled at the guests, shook hands with people whose names he would never remember, and said nothing. But later that night, sitting alone in his truck in the parking lot, he pressed his palms flat against the steering wheel and stared at the calluses that had built every room his daughter had ever slept in. That was the night James understood clearly for the first time. His children were not just distant, they were ashamed of him. After that evening, something shifted quietly inside James. He didn't stop loving them, but he stopped expecting them to see him. Holidays became shorter, phone calls became less frequent, visits turned into obligations that his children scheduled like appointments and canceled without much guilt. And while his children slowly erased him from their daily lives, James kept building, quietly, invisibly, the way he had always done. What none of them knew was that decades earlier, a client who couldn't afford to pay for a kitchen renovation had offered James a rundown duplex instead. James took it, spent his weekends restoring it, and rented both units within a month. He did it again the following year, and the year after that. Over 30 years, James bought 11 neglected properties, rebuilt every one of them with his own hands, and rented them out through a small company Eleanor had helped him set up before cancer took her away 12 years earlier. Every record, every deed, every contract was stored behind the door behind the kitchen, A hidden room James had built during a renovation 28 years ago, sealed so perfectly into the wall that even someone pressing their hand against it would never feel the seam. Now, if this story is already stirring something inside you, take a moment right now and subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell, because what James's children are about to do next will test everything you believe about family. And what his granddaughter pulls out of a dumpster will change the entire direction of this story. On a cold Wednesday morning in late November, James woke with a dull ache in his left shoulder. He made coffee, sat at the kitchen table the way he always did, and was halfway through the newspaper when the pain suddenly sharpened and spread across his chest like someone had wrapped a belt around his ribs and started pulling. His coffee cup shattered on the floor. The last thing he saw before everything went dark was the kitchen wall, the one with the hidden seam, steady and silent as it had always been. A mail carrier found him 2 hours later through the side window and called 911. At the hospital, doctors confirmed a massive heart attack and moved James into the ICU, where machines monitored his breathing and kept his heart stable, while specialists waited to see how much damage had been done. His children were called that same night. David arrived first, then Karen, then Lisa. They stood around his bed looking worried and exhausted, and for a few hours they looked exactly like children who were afraid of losing their father. But by the second morning, the worry had already started wearing a different face. It was David who changed the conversation first, standing near the vending machines with his phone pressed to his ear, talking quietly about property values and liquidation timelines. Karen overheard and stepped closer. "What are you thinking?" she asked. David lowered the phone. "Dad's 74. Even if he pulls through, he's not going back to that house alone. We need to start being practical." Lisa joined them a few minutes later, arms folded, nodding along, without saying much. And within half an hour, the three of them were no longer talking about their father's heart. They were talking about his house, how much it was worth, how quickly they could list it, and who would handle the sale. David had already pulled up property estimates on his phone before the cardiologist came back with updated test results. By the end of the week, they had a plan. And they moved fast. David used his connections to fast-track an emergency power of attorney filing, claiming James was mentally incapacitated and unable to manage his own affairs. Karen contacted a real estate agent before the paperwork was even processed. Lisa began calling estate sale companies to schedule walkthroughs. The following Monday, they arrived at the house on Beckley Road with a moving truck and a checklist. They started in the living room, pulling framed photographs off the walls and wrapping furniture in blankets. They moved through the bedrooms, boxing up decades of clothing, books, and personal belongings without pausing to look at any of it. They cleared the kitchen cabinets James had crafted with his own hands, tossing dishes and utensils into boxes marked for donation. But nothing they did that week compared to what they did in the workshop. James's workshop sat behind the kitchen in a converted back porch he had enclosed and insulated himself years ago. It was the room where he had spent more hours than any other place in the house. The walls were lined with pegboards holding hand tools that stretched back 3 generations. His grandfather's draw knife, his father's block plane, a set of chisels James had used on his very first paying job when he was 17 years old. Every tool had a place, every place had a purpose, and every piece carried a memory older than his children's entire lives. David walked in, looked around, and shrugged. "None of this is worth anything. Just clear it out." They swept the tools off the pegboard and dumped them into cardboard boxes. They carried those boxes to the dumpster at the end of the driveway and tossed them on top of broken drywall and old insulation. Hand planes, marking gauges, coping saws, tenon chisels, 3 generations of craftsmanship thrown away like scrap from a demolition site. Lisa carried the last box out herself and didn't look back. Within 10 days, every room was stripped bare. David accepted an offer from a developer who wanted to tear the house down and build condominiums. The for sale sign went up on a Tuesday, and the only thing they never touched was the kitchen wall. They walked past it dozens of times, leaned against it while making phone calls, pressed a hand flat against it while arguing about closing dates, and never once felt the seam that ran along the edge of a hidden panel 4 inches from the corner. They never heard the faint hollow sound that a carpenter would have recognized instantly. They never thought to ask why one section of wall was slightly thicker than the rest, because they had never paid attention to the things their father built. But someone had been paying attention all along. Nina Whitmore was 19 years old, Karen's daughter, a sophomore at the state university who had visited her grandfather every single Sunday for as long as she could remember. She had more of James in her than Karen had ever been comfortable with. Nina liked building things. She liked asking questions. She liked sitting in the workshop watching James shape a piece of oak into something beautiful while he told her stories about her grandmother. When Nina drove past the house on Beckley Road and saw the dumpster in the driveway, she pulled over. She climbed in without hesitation. And there, buried under chunks of drywall and twisted insulation, she found it. A number 5 Stanley Bailey hand plane with a rosewood handle worn smooth by 3 generations of palms. It had belonged to James's father, and before that, his grandfather. It was the first tool James had ever held. Nina wrapped it in a shop towel, set it in her passenger seat, and drove straight to the hospital. When she walked into James's room 2 days after he had opened his eyes for the first time in 9 days, she set the hand plane on his bedside table and carefully unfolded the towel. Her eyes were red when she spoke. "I found it in the dumpster, Grandpa. They threw everything away." James looked at the plane for a long time. He picked it up slowly and felt the familiar weight settle into his palm like a handshake from someone he hadn't seen in years. His thumb traced the dent near the heel that his father had put there in 1961 while building a hope chest for James's mother. He didn't cry. He set the plane down gently, looked at Nina, and said, "Hand me the phone." The call lasted less than 4 minutes. On the other end was Arthur Calloway, James's attorney for 22 years, a man who knew more about James Whitmore's true life than his children had ever cared to learn. James spoke calmly and clearly, giving instructions that Arthur wrote down without a single interruption. When he hung up, he turned to Nina and said quietly, "Don't tell your mother." 2 weeks later, David received a letter requesting his presence at a meeting to finalize estate arrangements for the Beckley Road property. Karen and Lisa received identical letters. All 3 arrived at the lawyer's office on a Tuesday morning, dressed in business clothes and carrying folders of paperwork. David had even prepared a breakdown of how the sale proceeds should be split, with his own share slightly larger for what he called administrative costs. Arthur Calloway was waiting in the conference room with a calm expression and a stack of documents. At the far end of the table sat an empty chair. "Before we begin," Arthur said, "someone else would like to join us." The side door opened, and James Whitmore walked in slowly, leaning on a cane but standing upright, wearing a clean flannel shirt and the quiet, steady expression his children had seen 1,000 times, but never once tried to understand. He sat down at the head of the table without a word, placed his hands flat on the surface, and looked at each of them the same way he used to study a piece of wood before deciding what it could become. David spoke first. "Dad, you look good. We didn't expect—" "I know what you did," James said quietly. The room went cold. Arthur opened the first folder. "The power of attorney filing has been reviewed and rejected. Mr. Whitmore was never declared incapacitated by a physician. The filing was made without proper documentation and is legally invalid." David's face drained of color. Arthur continued without pausing. "The pending sale of 412 Beckley Road is also void. The property is held in a revocable living trust established in 1998. Mr. Whitmore is the sole trustee. No sale or transfer can occur without his written authorization. He has given none." Karen leaned forward. "We didn't know about any trust." James looked at her. "You didn't ask." Arthur opened a thicker folder and spread documents across the table. "Mr. Whitmore owns 11 additional residential and commercial rental properties throughout the county, all held within the same trust. Combined current market value based on recent appraisals is approximately $4.7 million. The silence that followed was so deep you could hear the air conditioner humming through the vents. Lisa's lips parted, but no words came. David stared at the papers without blinking. Karen sat frozen, as though breathing too hard might make the number disappear. David finally whispered, "That's not possible. He's a carpenter." James held up his hands, scarred, calloused, slightly bent from decades of gripping tools. "I am a carpenter," he said, "and I built every one of those properties back from nothing with these hands, the same hands you were too embarrassed to tell people about." Arthur placed one final sheet on the table. These are bank records spanning 25 years documenting payments made by Mr. Whitmore. David's MBA tuition, $84,000 paid anonymously through the University Financial Aid Office. Karen's first mortgage, $62,000 applied as a principal reduction she believed was a bank adjustment. Lisa's entire wedding, $41,000 paid directly to the venue, the caterer, and the florist from an account none of you knew existed. Lisa's hands were shaking. Tears ran down her face as her eyes landed on the payment dated the same year she told a room full of strangers her father worked in construction management. Karen pressed both hands over her mouth. David set the paper down slowly, like a man realizing the ground beneath him had never been as solid as he thought. Arthur read the final amendment. 60% of all assets would fund the Whitmore Vocational Scholarship Foundation, providing apprenticeships and training for young people entering the building trades. 25% would go to Nina, held in trust until she turned 25. The remaining 15% would be split equally among his 3 children. David looked up. 15%? Between 3 of us? James met his eyes without blinking. You sold my tools, David, your grandfather's tools, your great-grandfather's tools. You threw them in a dumpster like garbage. You tried to sell a house I built with my own hands while I was lying in a hospital bed. 15% is more than you earned. Then James did something none of them expected. He paused, let the silence hold for a long moment, and softened his voice. But you are still my children, he said, and I didn't build everything I built just to watch this family collapse. So here's what I am offering you. Not money, something harder. He looked at each of them in turn. Come back. Not to the inheritance. Come back to me. Visit me on Sundays the way Nina does, sit at my kitchen table, ask me how I am, learn what I actually built and why I built it. And maybe, over time, you'll understand that what I wanted to leave you was never the money. It was the way I earned it, with patience, with these hands, and with a respect for work that none of you ever let me teach you. Karen broke first. She stood up, walked to the head of the table, and put her arms around her father for the first time in years. Lisa followed. David sat still for a long moment, jaw tight, eyes wet, and then he stood and joined them. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the first honest thing the 4 of them had shared in longer than any of them could remember. 3 months later, the house on Beckley Road was still standing. The for sale sign was gone. The dumpster was gone. The front porch had a fresh coat of paint, and the workshop behind the kitchen had been restocked with tools, some old, some new, all hanging in their proper places. On Saturday afternoons, if you walked past the house, you could hear the steady sound of a handplane gliding across a piece of white oak, slow and deliberate, the way a man works when he knows exactly what he is building and who he is building it for. James was making a table for Nina's first apartment. Small, clean lines, hand-cut joinery, built from a piece of wood he had been saving for years. And if you listened closely on those Saturday afternoons, you might hear something else, 2 voices inside the workshop instead of 1. Because David had started coming by on weekends. He didn't say much at first. He just stood near the doorway watching his father work. But one afternoon, James held out a sanding block without looking up and said, "Make yourself useful." David took it, and for the first time in his adult life, he worked quietly beside his father without saying a word, and understood finally that some things are not built with money or ambition or impressive job titles. They are built slowly, by hand, by people who show up and stay. The hidden. Doctor behind the kitchen was still there. James never sealed it. He never showed it to anyone else. He simply closed the panel, pressed it flush until the seam disappeared, and left it exactly where it had always been, waiting patiently for the one person who might one day deserve to know it was there. And on Sunday mornings, when Nina sat at the kitchen table with coffee going cold because she forgot to drink it, looking over property records the same way her grandmother Eleanor once had, James would glance at the kitchen wall and smile quietly to himself. Because a carpenter knows that the strongest joints are the ones you cannot see. And the most important things a man builds in his lifetime are never the ones people notice. They are the ones that hold everything together long after he is gone. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the channel's notification bell. See you in the next one.